as often. So I thought it would just be nice for us to learn and for us to schmooze a little. And before we start recording, I think we should start with the fact that you were talking about how you've been cooking a lot more. And if you, what's your go-to dish? What's the dish that you're most proud of, or the one that you are really just loving to cook these days?
I'm an eclectic cook, so I cook a little bit of everything. I mean, we've been doing a lot of vegetable dishes, ratatouille, chilies, vegetable soups, things like that, because they're hearty. It's freezing cold here in Southern California. For those of you listening from the East Coast today, it's supposed to plunge to a freezing 78 degrees. So having a warm, hearty soup with a good piece of bread is a very good old school meal. So those are the things that I've been cooking recently. So it's nice to be with you, Joel. It's really always been wonderful to work with you and to learn with you. And it's wonderful to be with the Wilshire community. My little connection with the Wilshire community is that when I started working at Valley Beth Shalom in the 1990s, Rabbi Leader came to Wilshire. And we found ourselves in the same sort of position. He at the time was the second rabbi to Rabbi Harvey Fields, alav Shalom, a wonderful scholar and teacher. And I was the second to Harold Schulweis, who was my mentor, also a wonderful scholar. So Rabbi Leader and I used to get together frequently and share stories of being the second rabbi and share sermons and share. So we got very, very close. Stephen and I, and continue to be very close. And he's one of my favorite rabbis in the world. And his new book, by the way, if you haven't gotten it, is just truly an extraordinary book. It's a wonderful reflection on the death of his father and what he learned about death and dying from that experience. And I recommend it to everybody. The only thing I told him is that, this book is an extraordinary reflection on death and dying, and the last book was an extraordinary reflection on suffering. So I'm kind of worried about him. So a bunch of us fellas got together, put together a fund to send him and Betsy to Hawaii for a couple of weeks, just to sort of clean out his head a little bit, because too much suffering, death. I mean, he needs a little love. So.
I'm
But
sure he would appreciate that.
I admire Rabbi Leader very much and the wonderful accomplishments of the Wilshire community.
Oh, thanks. Well, I guess we could start with just what has it been like for you to be the rabbi of a big synagogue right now amidst everything that's going on locally and nationally? I mean, how are you dealing with this, both as a rabbi and as a person? What are you learning from all
Well,
of this?
Jewish life is all about community. It's about sharing. It's about being together. Somebody dies, we come for Shiva. We bring cake and prayer and closeness. There's a simcha, bar mitzvah, a birth of a child, a wedding. We come together to celebrate, and we're not able to do that. And that's so tragic. That is so difficult. Friday night, we have a minyan. We have people who gather together to sing and pray, and just to be in the same room and hear people's prayers, to be near the mourner who's remembering a loved one, to be near the new family who's bringing a baby, to share the minyan. This is what Jewish life is really about. This is what my teacher Harold Schulweis used to teach about in terms of chavurah, of the closeness that we share, and COVID has made that impossible. So we can do it in a facsimile here on Zoom and on Facebook, but it's not the same as being together. And that's been the great catastrophe. That's been the great tragedy. That plus the economic catastrophe that's affected all of our communities. But what COVID has done is so interesting. I mean, when we get to write the history of this, when we're far enough away from it, it seems to me that you have an American culture which is so deeply invested in individualism. Remember, our flag once said, "Don't tread on me," right? Cole Porter saying, "Don't fence me in." You know, this is American individualism. All of our heroes are loners. It's Superman out by himself fighting for justice, or Aquaman or Wonder Woman. It's the loner who's out there fighting, the entrepreneur, the pioneer, the maverick. So we like to go it alone. That's our motto. Break the rules and go it alone, and that's individualism of America. And in a certain strange and weird and remarkably ironic way, it's like God and nature have said, okay, you want to be an individualist? You want to go it alone? I'll show you what that's like to its extreme. I'll put you into your loneliness in the most extreme way. Now, every one of us rabbis, ministers, priests, people of religion know that every truth has an equal and opposite truth, which is equally true. And the opposite truth of individualism is family and community, is the need for human connection, is what Buber called the I thou. And that's what we miss now. So this individualism, this enforced isolation, this enforced quarantine, this enforced individualism has reminded us that the other truth is so much more powerful. We need each other. We absolutely need to be with each other. And we miss each other. And what's so interesting to me is that we not only miss our families, I miss having Shabbos dinner with my kids. I miss my friends, the community I would gather with to celebrate life. I miss my colleagues at work. I miss the community of the synagogue. I miss the community of our Chavurah. But we even miss the casual relations. I miss sitting in Starbucks with other people. I miss sitting in a restaurant, overhearing the conversation at the next table and listening to the clinking of silverware. I miss the movie theater. You know, when we get to laugh and cry together with a group of strangers, but we're gathered by the film. I miss the ballpark where we can cheer together. You know, and we've learned how much we need each other. So COVID, I think COVID has come to teach us a deep, deep biblical truth. Lo tov heyot adam livado. You can't go it alone. You can't live alone. So as much as I resent this and hate it and wish we could get over it, I'm waiting for my vaccination already, and want to go back to quote unquote normal. Normal won't be the same when we go back because we've learned something about what's important.
So do you, based on that and this idea that because we're so isolated, we've learned even more so the value of community and connection, do you think that this means that there's going to be kind of almost a resurgence of connection and community, and that the Jewish community is going to thrive, or that in your case, your synagogue is going to transform in new ways as a result of people recognizing their need for one another?
You know, historically, the only analog we have to this is the great Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. The problem is that what's complicated, of course, it was also the end of the First World War. But what we know is that from when that epidemic waned, which was late in 1919, that's exactly what happened. There was a rush to join. There was a rush of community life. People packed the churches and synagogues. People came back to restaurants and theater and sport. That was the roaring 20s. People wanted to celebrate life. They wanted to assert themselves. There was a baby boom. People wanted to assert life in the face of so much death that was around them, and assert connection in the face of so much separation. That's what the early 20s were all about. And I expect that to happen again. Right? I expect people to come back to shul in big numbers. I expect people to come back to theater, to sport, to restaurants, to community life in big numbers. I think we're going to see a resurgence of that part of our American experience, which is quite remarkable because it had been waning, really, really attenuated in the years that we've experienced, and I really expect it to come back in a very, very big way. I'll just give you a silly example. Some years ago, Nina and I were doing some traveling in the Northwest, and we were in Vancouver, and we checked into a bed and breakfast, and everyone was running out of the house. And I said to the innkeeper, "Where are we going?" He said, "All right, put your stuff down." He said, "Grab a blanket from the bed and come with me." And they took us down. This was midsummer in Vancouver. Turns out that in midsummer Vancouver, there is a civic fireworks contest. Every Tuesday night for the month of July, they invite another world-class fireworks company to put fireworks over the harbor. And the whole city of Vancouver goes down to the harbor, down to the sort of the beach area, and you spread out a blanket, you bring a radio, and there's a soundtrack on the radio, and 1 week it's the Spanish crew, and 1 week it's the Japanese crew, and 1 week it's the British crew or the Chinese crew or the Filipino, and they put on these amazing fireworks shows. But you're talking about 500,000 people watching fireworks at the same time. Now, I'm thinking about that. It's like, we don't have that in America. We don't have times when the whole city of Los Angeles comes out to do something. The closest we have is when the Lakers win. We all scream and we put those schmitchiks on our car antennas. But yeah, I think that this is going to happen. I think we're going to see civic celebrations just because we want to be together. Look, in my neighborhood, everyone's taken to walking. First, there's no traffic anymore on the street. Everyone walks. And we've met all of our neighbors. And I know lots of other people have the same experience because I live in the valley. And in the valley, everybody lives with these giant walls between us. Well, the walls have come down, at least spiritually. And now we're all out on the street at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the afternoon, celebrating, just waving at people, right? And you meet everybody's dog and you meet everybody's kids and everybody's riding bikes. And I think it's coming. I really do think we're going to have a resurgence of civic community.
So you're very hopeful, which is so wonderful to hear. And I'm curious that what has been that sense of hope for you during all of this? I think about me personally, both as a father, as a rabbi, as a husband. The challenges and the ups and downs with dealing with the monotony of this pandemic and being stuck at home. For you personally, what have been those sources of inspiration or hope for you? How are you sustaining yourself? Like what are the keys to your success of dealing with all the deaths and all the challenges that you're having to face with your congregants, and then of course just the fact that you are stuck at home as well? How are you dealing with that?
Well, look, I'm a rabbi, Joel. I can make you cry. I mean, I know more pessimism, more darkness, more depression than that, because I'm the heir to a long Jewish tradition of feeling lousy, that's who we are. Jews are like this. The famous Jewish telegram is start worrying, details will follow. We're a people. Abba Eban, the great scholar and diplomat, said Jews are the only people in the world refuse to take yes for an answer. Every silver lining has to have a cloud. You can't live that way. That's not a way to live. Right? The national anthem of the Jewish people is Hatikva. We have to find hope. And even in the course of the worst, and we Jews know the worst. We know a lot worse than COVID. We know the worst. And yet we always maintain hope. That's what you read in our prayers. That's what you hear in our holidays. That's every Saturday night, you gather your family in your arms and you sing Eli Novi, right? Bimhe Rabbi Amenu Yavo V'Yigalenu. Let God come and redeem us. That's Jewish. Hope is Jewish. So yes, the death toll around us is spectacularly horrifying. And as a rabbi, I've gone to the cemetery. We've had a whole long spate of deaths. I've gone to the cemetery 25 times in the last 3 weeks, right? And even if those people didn't die of COVID, COVID was involved because it blocked them from getting care. It kept them isolated in the hospital. So many of these poor people died, and the only human being in the room with them was the nurse. God bless the nurses, right? So look, what are you going to do? I could be depressed. And on the other hand, I find hope. Yeah, the nurses, the doctors. I have friends who work in infectious diseases. You know how many of these guys have set aside their normal protocols of research to join the research project on the vaccine? And that this vaccine, not only is it the fastest vaccine they've ever created in all of human history, but it's based on an entirely new biochemistry. This chemistry of mRNA, of this messenger RNA. They've never had a vaccine like this. This is the first time they've used this chemistry to create a vaccine. And this vaccine, by the way, is going to open up vaccines. They're going to cure the common cold because it is also a COVID virus. They're going to cure flu. This vaccine is so remarkable. And the fact that thousands of scientists all over the world have set aside their normal protocols of research to join the effort, to devote their ingenuity and their powers of mind and powers of imagination to discover it and to develop it. I have friends who are doctors and nurses like you do, and I talk to them in the evening and they're exhausted and they're depleted. But boy, are they committed. You can't but cry at how committed these people are. So yes, I have hope because I see the other side of this. The other side of this is the explosion of caring, the explosion of community, of reaching out to each other. In my shul, we have a project. We located 180 people at Valley Beth Shalom will live alone. And we're calling every one of them every week. Every one of them gets a phone call once a week from a volunteer saying, how you doing? Can we get you anything? I got a crew of teenagers. I talk their parents into giving them the car keys so that they can deliver groceries and pharmaceuticals and just cheer, just joy to people who were locked up in their own homes alone. So yeah, you got to hope. You got to tell the narrative of hope. Otherwise, we all melt inside. It's too easy to be pessimistic, and it takes no moral courage to be a pessimist. None. So I have no respect for people like that. I'm a realist. I see what's in front of me. I'm not blind to what's in front of me. But on the other hand, I'm looking for that which gives us some inspiration and some power and some hope.
You're an incredible storyteller. It's one of the things that I've always loved learning from you, is just listening to the way you tell stories. Your book Capturing the Moon is just a classic, and everyone should have that on their bookshelf as well. And I'm wondering, it comes so easily for you, and I know you used to be in a camp setting where you told a lot of stories before you even got to VBS, but what are the ingredients of good storytelling? Not only do I want to know personally because I want to continue to hone that craft, but if we think about Jews and the fact that the Torah really is about stories, and that we teach our values, we teach our history through stories, that there's no more powerful method than through storytelling. What for you are the key ingredients of a good story, and can you just talk to us a little bit how you craft stories in your own mind? I know it comes probably so naturally now, but if you had to break it down into the pieces, what are those pieces?
Well, what happened with my first job when I graduated seminary, Nina and I moved to Dallas, Texas, and I had a dual job. I was the director of the day school of the new, what's called Solomon Schechter Day School of Dallas. And we were a nursery school, and we had K1 and 2, and each year we added another grade through grade 8 till the school was very big. And then in my spare time, I was the assistant rabbi of a very large conservative synagogue. So my Fridays would go like this. I would come to school in the morning, and Friday morning I told a story to the nursery school, I told a story to the kindergarten, and then I told a story to the day school. Right? So I told 3 Shabbos stories in the morning, and then I had to hunker down and write a sermon for either Friday night or Shabbos morning. My mentor, my senior rabbi, would take the other one. So, this is what I would do. And at first it was okay. And then what happened is, as life became more complicated, it was harder for me to hunker down on a Friday and write that sermon. So one Friday, I forgot what the exact circumstances were. I think either my kids were sick, or I was too tired, or something happened in the school, and I couldn't write the sermon. I didn't have time to write the sermon. So I said, what the hell? I took the story that I told the kids in the morning, and I told it to the grown-ups at night. And all I did was stop at the end and give a little moral of the story. And wouldn't you know it, of all the sermons I'd given that year, that was the only one anyone ever remembered. It's like, remember that great sermon about the fish? I said, yeah. And I discovered something, that stories stay with us. That's the why the Torah is written in stories. Stories stay with us. Story is the way that we construct reality, because what a story is, a narrative, is a way of stitching together discrete experiences into some kind of an orderly structure. That's the theory of narrative. But really, it fits with us, because we human beings, we like to find order in disparate things. We like to find order in these things. So when you have a story, what a story does is give order to your experience. And it's very satisfying, right? And then what I do is I just read a lot, and I study a lot. And if I find stories that just sort of strike me as interesting, then I take the story and I start telling it over and over again. And the best way to do is tell to little kids, because if you can engage a 3-year-old, you can engage anybody. And the fact is that stories work for grown-ups only because we never really outgrow the 3-year-old inside of us who sits there going, oh, tell me another one, And that really is what I look for. That plus, of course, animal sounds. If I had known the importance of animal sounds in my rabbinate, I would have studied them harder in rabbinical school, horses and cows and sheep and chickens. But that's a joke. But the truth of the matter is, story is a way so there's a beautiful saying among storytellers, which isn't that we don't tell stories, stories tell us. When we meet each other and I say, Joel, tell me about yourself, you tell me a story. If I tell me about how you met Julia, tell me about the birth of your children or the growth of your children, tell me about the tragedies in your life. We all tell stories. We are the stories that we tell. And the beauty of a tradition of storytelling is that it gives us more stories to tell. And it reminds us that redemption is part of our story, that creation is part of our story, that revelation is part of our story. All of these sort of categories of theological, philosophical life are really the stories we tell about each other, right? And that's what I love about stories. So that's how I give sermons. That's how I do weddings and funerals. I look for a story. Let me just say one more thing about that. See, one of the most profound things that you and I get to do, scary but profound, is to come with a family and to perform a funeral service, to lead them. The Hebrew word is livaya, which means to walk with them, that last walk to the grave, to lower the casket into the grave. And then you and I have had this experience to look into their eyes and tell them something about the loved one that they cherish, to remind them that there are elements to the life that don't die when a body dies, but there's an immortality of soul and spirit and influence and wisdom in the life that they're grieving. And what happens, what I discovered as a young rabbi, and I it keeps discovering it every time I have to do this, is that at that moment you can tell the story of the life. It's harder to tell the story of life beforehand because everything that we subsequently do changes the story. But at that moment, it's our job, your job and my job, to tell them, here is the story of your loved one's life. And what's amazing is that you can do that. Life really is a story. It has beginnings and it has crises and it has resolutions and it has themes that are coherent, themes and memes that are coherent through the life. And that's when you really discover the power of a story. When you can say to that family, here's the story of your loved one, and here's what they wanted you to learn from it. Which is classic storytelling. And at that moment, you've given them a precious gift because you've given them back the life of the loved one. And that's the most powerful thing you and I can do.
Is there a story you've told so many, and you've created and you've rediscovered and you've reignited stories from our tradition and your own stories? Is there one right now that seems to be standing out to you, or one that over time has inspired you, or kind of you would see as a fundamental, foundational story that has guided you either personally, professionally, in some way?
Yeah, there are a bunch of them. I mean, the book that you mentioned, Capturing the Moon, I started telling stories as a young rabbi when I was a school director, and a rabbi in a synagogue, and then I was a camp director for some years. And right after that, my kids were small. I had cancer. I had it twice. The first time was serious. The second time was deadly. I mean, it was a very serious cancer. Serious enough and I'm not making this up, for a doctor to ask me if my life insurance was paid up, And I realized that if something were to happen to me, this was a gift I wanted to give to my children. So the reason for that book, Capturing the Moon, was because I didn't want my kids to forget the stories that I told them. So I sat down while I was recovering from the cancer surgery and taking chemotherapy. In the moments that I wasn't terribly sick, I sat down and I wrote out 36 stories. And I sent them to my dear friend David Berman, who's a wonderful publisher of Jewish books. And that's how Capturing the Moon came to be. There's a story in that book, which is actually the first story I learned to tell, and I still love it. And I think it's me. It's the story that I continue to. It's about two guys who live in a village, a rich man and a poor man. It actually is a story that was once told around the circle of Isaac Luria, but I changed it a little bit. It's been changed a little bit. And basically the story is that the rich man lives alone and wishes to share his Shabbos table with somebody as important as him. And so he tells his baker to bring 2 more challahs. And before Friday night service, he puts the challahs in the ark. And suddenly his Shabbat has a sweetness he never experienced. And that very same week, the poor man couldn't make a penny. And he doesn't want to go home and face it. He has a big family, ironically. And he doesn't want to face hungry children. So he makes a prayer to God in the synagogue. If you want me to go home, you're going to have to make a miracle. And he bangs his hands on the door of the ark, and out tumble 2 challahs. And this goes on for a year. right? This goes on for a whole year. Every week, the rich man puts challahs in the ark, and every week, the poor man comes and takes them. And then finally, at the end of the story, the shamus of the synagogue comes and sees this happening, and he breaks the miracle. He brings the two men together, and he says, "You're a fool. God doesn't eat challah, and God doesn't feed poor people." And then that night, the rabbi calls them both together and says to the shamus, he says to the rich man and the poor man, "This was a miracle that brought joy to the heart of God, and the world will not go on another day unless you reproduce it." And so from that day onward, the poor man enjoyed Shabbos at the table of the rich man. And then he turned to the shamus and he said, "You're an evil man. You've broke one of God's miracles. Now go into the world and wander the world and tell the story until every Jew in the world has heard the story. And when you die, your children will go, and when you go, their children, until everyone in the world knows the story. And then that's why it's my obligation to tell you the story." Now, I love that story because what it focuses on the ark. And what it says to us is that the ark, the Torah, is not a dead thing. The ark is a place of exchange. It's where those who have spiritual strength and wisdom and what to give, we contribute and we put it in there. And those who are in need, who are bereft, who are hungry, who are in trouble, we take it out. Torah is Eitz Chaim. It's a tree. It's a living organism of community and caring and love. That's what the story tells. And that it's our job to keep that miracle alive, which is sort of what I do. So that's my favorite story.
It's a great one. Yeah, another story
that
you've
and
told.
35 other stories are
right.
in the book.
It really is. Everyone should
right
have
now,
that
I'm
book.
just kidding.
No, it's true though. Another story that you've told is really the story of one of your rabbis and who was the senior rabbi, as you mentioned, when you got to VBS, Harold Schulweis. And you wrote a book about him that came out recently as well, so people can go and read that. And since he's no longer with us, what do you think Rabbi Schulweis would be saying these days, given everything that's happening in our nation, given what's going on even locally? If you had to channel him and his teachings and his theology, what do you think he would be talking about or charging us or the Jewish community or the world to be doing right now?
That's a great question. I thought about that an awful lot because I still talk to him. You have to realize that when people die, they don't really die. A body dies and it's buried in a cemetery, but a spirit lives with us. So Harold visits me all the time, and sometimes he's pretty angry, and sometimes he's very satisfied. So I talk to him all the time and ask him. You see, Harold Schulweis was well known for the power of his oratory and the power of his moral vision. He was well known for the innovations that he introduced into synagogue life. He's the one that invented chavurot in synagogues, and he's the one who invented paraprofessional counseling centers and synagogues. And he was the founder of Mazon, for example, along with Label Fine, and the founder of Jewish World Watch, and the founder of the Christian Foundation for Righteous for the Christian Rescuers. But the thing that he was most able to do, the thing that was really his genius, was to grasp what were the narratives that governed our lives, the narratives that governed Jewish life. And when he saw that those narratives, the stories we told about ourselves, were the wrong stories, he tried with all of his power to correct them. He did not believe that we were disappearing as a people. I mean, the narrative of Jewish life in the 1970s and 80s was continuity, which meant we're threatened, we're assimilating, we're intermarrying away, we're losing our grasp on our kids. And we have to do something about it, right? That was the narrative that you heard over and over again. And he said, no, if we offer our children a morally and intellectually stimulating, inspiring Judaism, they will come to us. But if we offer them Jewish drivel, if it's dull, if it's uninspiring, if it doesn't challenge them to think about their lives differently, then of course they're going to leave. They're going to go elsewhere to find that. I mean, this was his genius was to find those narratives and then fix them, try to fix them. So right now it's like, what's the narrative now? It's something that you and I think a lot about. I mean, the narrative right now is this narrative of isolation, separation, and quarantine. And I think that he would come to us and say, this is a time when we are learning how much we need each other, and how important community is, and how important institutions are. American Judaism, American religion, not just Judaism, but American religion right now, particularly as it's expressed by the younger generations, by millennials, they're not less spiritual. They're just less institutional. They have a deep suspicion of institutions. And frankly, they come about it honestly because institutions have done them wrong. Well, this is an opportunity for institutions to fix themselves and get themselves right. And to go back to those millennials and say, you need institutions, because institutions carry forward your values past your own life, past your own limitations of time and energy and resources. Look how much Wilshire Boulevard Temple is able to accomplish, because it's the collection of collected will. That's what institutions do. And I think that he'd say to us, what COVID has taught us is how much we need each other, how important it is to be a family, a community, circles of friends, circles of chevra, of chavura. But more than that, how important these institutions are. And this is an opportunity for institutions to clean up their act, get it right, and offer a clear reason to belong, a clear reason to join, a clear reason to be part of something bigger than yourself. And it's a chance for this generation to recommit itself to a new set of institutions that really express its deepest values. That's my guess. That's what I think he would be saying right now. We had an interesting experience in my neighborhood, just really quickly. We had a shopping center up the street, which had everything a human being needed. We had a beautiful Ralph's supermarket. We had a beautiful a Blockbuster Video, Oliver Shalom, right? We had a good bank, and it had a Starbucks, and it had a Barnes & Noble bookshop. So every day, every night, that parking lot was jammed because there were people shopping in a Ralph's, and there are people shopping, and at nighttime, we'd all fill the Barnes & Noble, right? Well, here's what happened. The shopping center is like changed. And the first thing that went, besides Blockbuster, the first thing was Barnes & Noble. And they announced to the community that they're closing. And there were people on my gate like, what do you mean closing? You're the Barnes & Noble. You're the bookstore. So somebody called Barnes & Noble in New York and discovered that this was a profitable store, but that the landlord had gotten a higher bid for the property from CVS drugstore. So our Barnes & Noble was going to become a CVS. People in my neighborhood protested. There were marches. There were signs. There were pickets. The people to this day will not shop in that CVS drugstore. They're still angry. Now, that's such an interesting thing. We buy books on Amazon. I buy books. We wanted a Barnes & Noble because we wanted a place that said books matter, literature matters, learning matters, community, because it had book nights every night. And I gave a couple of nights there. It was wonderful. Well, the Barnes & Noble went away. And when the Barnes & Noble went away, people in my neighborhood, young people who had never thought of this before, started to realize the institutions that surround you are not like these trees outside that were there for 300 years before we got here, and nobody waters them and takes care of them. The institutions need to be nurtured and protected. Otherwise, they disappear too, right? It was easy. I gave a great sermon. I could say, we're VBS, but we could be CVS. They could change Barnes & Noble. They could take over our property too, But we have to protect these institutions because they matter to us. I sort of think that may be what Harold would be saying now. Now, those institutions have to earn our respect. They have to earn our loyalty, no question about it. They have to get their act together. But the institutions matter.
Yeah. I remember I was also upset when that CVS opened at the corner of Havenhurst and Ventura.
I'm trying to be discreet about it, and you're being more.
I'm being more direct because I remember also the Starbucks was literally, there were doors that opened into the Barnes & Noble.
Yeah,
and
you
so
got
it was
coffee.
Also, right. It was about this. It was the community was not even just limited to the bookstore. It was like this free flowing institutional role that one institution was not necessarily even isolated from the other, but that there were doors that allowed you to meld those spaces and
Absolutely.
And we need that, right? In a time where I feel like institutions are maybe closing their doors more and hunkering down, what does it mean to open those doors back up again?
That's a beautiful way to think about it. And and
Yeah.
people in my neighborhood would echo George Carlin by saying, we once had a store that advertised books, and now we have a store that advertised drugs, right? Is that what we want our children to hear? You don't need books, you just need drugs. Sounds like a George Carlin routine. Oliver
Yes.
Shalom.
Yeah.
But it was true. It's something we don't, and I don't want to get into the politics today. I mean, that's certainly another situation in which the institutions that we depend upon have been attacked and have been neglected and have been overlooked. And it's time now to bolster and protect them too.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to keep you any longer, though I could learn from you forever. I just want to thank you for
Thank you, Joe.
being my teacher and my mentor, for being the teacher to thousands in your own community around Los Angeles, around the world, really. And thank you for your wisdom, for your storytelling, for your inspiration, and all that you do for the Jewish world. So I
And
really,
thank you,
really
Joel. And thank
deeply
you to you
appreciate
and
it.
to Julia for your podcast, which we've enjoyed so very, very much.
Or our
And
little
thank you
videos.
to
Yeah.
right there. And thank you to you and to all the families, the members, and the friends of Wilshire Below our temple for the wonderful work that you do in the community. So take good care and be